Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Bontemps. I am conducting an oral interview today with Ann Newton in Effingham, Illinois. The interview is for second assignment for my public history class 470 to 500 at SIU Edwardsville. Today is July the 12th. And Mother, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Ann Newton, as Stephanie has said. I am 85 years old. I am the daughter and niece of 6 men who served in combat roles in World War I and II, so I'm very linked to history through them, through their actions. I am a retired teacher, junior high level, history, English, and library, and I'm the proud grandmother of 4 grandchildren, 2 boys and 2 girls. I have spent most of my life in Effingham, which is where my parents met and married. But my father is from, or was from, Greenville in Bond County. His family, the Wanamagers, and that's a long Dutch name, were here before the Revolution and fought with the colonial troops against the British. And he further had 2 great uncles who served for 3 years with Grant in Union cavalry fighting the Confederacy. So there was a strong history link there. My mother's family was not as linked to the history of our country. My grandmother was a first generation American, and my grandfather came as an immigrant when he was 5 years old, along with his parents and 4 brothers. They came here from northern Germany, and I believe my great-grandparents' trigger that resulted in this immigration was the fact that Bismarck had shown so much aggression toward the Danes, and they did not want to see their sons inducted into the Prussian army. As a result of this period of history, both my parents were products of World War I, the Depression, and World War II. And I became part of that link when I was born in 1931. My mother felt the onus of being German at the time the war began because there was some anti-German feeling in Effingham. But since my grandfather, her father, had a 4-star flag in his window, she had 4 brothers in the service, they suffered no discrimination. And of course my father immediately volunteered for the Navy as a young man at 23, and he served on a ship, the Broad Arrow, in the North Atlantic, escorting convoys to the British and the French with war supplies. Now this was a converted oil tanker turned into a warship, and he was a gunner's mate first class. And he came out of the Navy. He went in as a small-town Republican linked to the days of the Civil War because Greenville had been so involved in that. Bond County sent 1,200 men to fight for the Union. He came back a Wilsonian internationalist, a strong believer in Navy and the Air Force, a fan of Billy Mitchell, and my mother was equally embroiled in a thirst for history, and this all was part of my growing up. We did not sit around the dinner table, excuse me, we did not sit around the dinner table and talk about our neighbor's new car. We talked about current events. I can remember when I was quite young, my father just erupting in anger when the Japanese invaded Manchuria. And of course, Pearl Harbor will forever be part of my memory. I was 10 years old, and we were living in Springfield at the time. My father was manager of the employment office there. He would soon become a War Manpower Commissioner and deal with the war plants in the area. But anyway, that day, December the 7th, 1941, I had gone to the movies with a neighbor. And when I came back to my home, I saw that the curtains were drawn, and I opened the door, and my father was pacing up and down, smoking one of his constant Camels and saying a few negative words and threatening to join the Navy again. I had to remind him he couldn't do that because he had an ulcer. But from that point on, from that day on, the news was on every night at dinner time, and we did not talk during dinner. We listened to the news.
Do you want to talk about what life was kind of like during the war, like shortages and?
Well, life centered on the war effort. For example, it wasn't just your diet that was limited because of rationing, but every week we brought money to school and bought war bonds or stamps. And by the time the war was over, in my grade school in Springfield, we had purchased enough stamps and war bonds within the student body that we had purchased a Jeep, and we were very proud of that. And then we moved back to Effingham, and I completed my high school year here. And once again, I was, in some respects, I was older than my peers because of this immersion in history. And so when I went off to Eastern Illinois University, I majored in it. I was very lucky to have some wonderful teachers whose memory will always be with me. And then I moved into teaching, and I enjoyed every moment of that, usually.
Do you want to back up a little bit about your time at Eastern and talk about a little bit about Korea?
Oh, yes. That summer, as I had completed my freshman year, war broke out in Korea. And many of my classmates, my male classmates, left. 2 were killed in the Naval Aviation Program as they were in the Caribbean and they were attempting to land on aircraft carriers, which is extremely dangerous. And 1 was killed in a night landing, and 1 was killed in a daytime exercise. I had a friend whose fiance was in Korea. So that was part of our life too. The history of our country and the conflicts therein, whether it was developing the United Nations or fighting in Korea or whatever, never left us. It was part of our growing up. It was part of our life experience.
And then as that moved into the later 50s, do you want to talk about your being a young Democrat and going to Chicago and
oh, yes.
getting to see Stevenson?
Of course, we went through the McCarthy era, and then in 1956, with my eyes full of stars, a friend and I went to Chicago to stay with another friend and to observe from the lobbies of the Blackstone Hotel and the Hilton the Democrats who came in and out. We were especially eager to see Stevenson, and I did get to see him. The night he accepted the nomination, we managed to get up to his floor in the Blackstone Hotel. And a very courteous Chicago detective came up to us and said, "Young ladies, what do you want?" And we said, "We do not want a job. We simply want to see Mr. Stevenson." And he asked us where we were from. And I said, "Well, I'm from Effingham. My friend was from Effingham, but teaching in Libertyville, Stevenson's hometown." And he said, "All right, we'll let you stay." And while we're standing there, the elevator doors opened and Adlai Stevenson came out, and the reporters pushed him to us. So I stood behind him with my nose in his neck while he talked to the reporters. And all I can tell you is that he had a beautiful smile and lovely blue eyes. And then off they went. And then we met a mayor of a town in Massachusetts. And he told us to come back the next morning and we would see Kennedy in action. This was before the convention had moved on and Kennedy was a contender for the vice presidency. So we were all excited. But when we got there, they had moved the meeting. And then we were furious with ourselves. Had we stayed the night before, lingered longer, we would have seen Johnson and Kennedy and a host of Democratic politicians of some importance.
And I think we still have your button with a little Stevenson shoe with the little hole on the bottom.
I still have the little silver shoe with the hole in the sole that became famous as he sat during one of his debates. Yes.
Do you remember anything about when Nixon gave his, speech about his wife's wearing the cloth coat and they have a dog named Checkers?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I remember the Checkers speech quite well. I did a lot of pacing in the living room. And, of course, I remember when he was then lost to Kennedy that night. I stayed up until 4 o'clock in the morning the night Kennedy was nominated, and I stayed up until 4 or 6 o'clock in the morning that the election was determined that it was a Kennedy victory.
Do you want to talk about the debates and how you thought?
I knew instantly that when the first debate that Kennedy would win.
But also people people you talked to, though, listened to it on the radio in the car, thought that Nixon had won.
Right. I had a friend who listened on the radio and thought Nixon had won. And I said, if you had seen his facial expressions and his unease and his inability to project any confidence, if you'd watched it on television, you would not think that. Another trauma that I lived through was the day that Kennedy was shot. I was teaching at that time 8th grade U.S. history in Greenup, Illinois, close to Effingham. I had a great class. I loved those kids. And it was lunchtime, and I was in my room grading papers, and one of my students, a boy, ran up and said, "Oh, Mrs. Newton, the president's been shot." And I foolishly said, "It's all right, Jerry. He survived the agony of World War II. He'll survive this." And of course, shortly after that, we knew he had not. And it was a very difficult time, very sad time.
Can you say, since you were actually very young, you were 33, 32, when he died, how that really affected you personally?
Yes. The day he was shot and killed, my mail was delivered to me by the secretary in the office. And one of the pieces I got was Look magazine, and John Kennedy and his son were on the cover. And it just crunched my heart because the boy was the same age as my daughter Stephanie. And after that, I experienced a period when I would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and worry about leaving my children. And I found out that this was a common thread of fear that ran through the lives of many mothers in the United States. This was a standard psychological reaction among young women, young mothers, to the president's death as they contemplated the future of their children.
Do you remember, if we could backtrack just a bit, about the feeling, especially toward the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of how Effinghamers or
yes,
anybody else was?
Yes.
Okay.
We felt vulnerable in Effingham because we were on the direct route between St. Louis and Chicago. St. Louis because it had the very important aircraft factory turning out fighter planes, and then of course the Fort Sheridan and the whole apparatus in Chicago. And so we planned to live in the basement with a chemical toilet, and we had gotten hay to put around our basement windows because it supposedly was a much better bulwark against radiation than straw. No, we stockpiled, and I was living with my parents and my maternal aunt and my 2 daughters, and we were prepared to stay in the basement for a month. It was a very frightful and incredibly emotional time.
So as we progress through the 60s, do you want to talk about the 64 election? I remember being 3.5 and you taking Leslie and I to Springfield to see President Johnson.
Yes, that was great fun. We got to Springfield, and I wanted the girls to see him because all my friends and my mother had seen Kennedy, and I had missed him. And I was very unhappy about that. I was determined to see Johnson. And so we went to the grounds around the old courthouse, the old state house, and I held Steph on my shoulders, and we got to see Johnson. He was extremely impressive in the flesh, tall, broad-shouldered, strong voice, and he looked around the crowd and he met your eyes. He didn't just read. And then afterwards he shook hands, as many as he could, and I did not shake his hand, but I was able to see him and expose my girls to this. I wanted them to do this because when I was in Chicago in '56, I was able to shake hands with Harry Truman, and it was quite an experience.
So, do you remember that election then? I mean, because Goldwater had kind of gone so far to the right.
Yes, Goldwater's. I had watched the convention with classmates in a grad class at Eastern, and I was at Illinois State that summer for a history class, and for a graduate class, and I watched the final night of the convention with some classmates, and that final line of his, the defense, whatever it was frightening. What was that line? Something about extremism in the defense of liberty is not a negative or something to that effect. And I know we all just shook our heads. We feared him. So I was very happy when Johnson won, even though Johnson took flack for that one ad with link to the bomb.
Oh, with the little girl taking the petals off the daisy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Extremism in the defense of liberty is not a crime or whatever.
And then later, he becomes more liberal in his thinking.
Yes, he did. Goldwater became much more liberal.
Well, then let's move forward. So then we're into Vietnam, and obviously we know that wasn't going very well. So we move into the '68 year, and
that was hard.
The two assassinations, April and then June.
Oh, that was terrible, because I was a terrific fan of Bobby Kennedy. He was my hero. But before that, like many mothers of daughters, I really didn't think, as I should have, about the sacrifice of war. Not until we'd been in Vietnam several years, and there was a column or segment in Life magazine that involved a wife of a combat pilot. It shook me to my toes, and I realized that I could be dispassionate about the war because I didn't have boys that were going. And that changed my attitude toward the war. On the other hand, I had a friend whose older sister's husband was a major or colonel in the Army, stationed at the Pentagon, and so she had a different outlook or intake on the war, and I understood that too. Because the colonel was shaken by the protests against the war. And of course, I don't know.
And then you had a friend who also was on TWA flights, bringing supplies to and bringing people out of your sorority sister. Remember? She had the...
You mean Lou?
No. But it didn't really matter. Your other sorority sister, she worked for TWA, and she was on one of the last flights out getting people out of Vietnam.
Oh, yes.
So...
Well, that was... If you've seen the newsreel shots of those people begging to be taken, standing by our embassy and grabbing hold of the rungs on a helicopter, it was very bad. It was anybody who cares about their country and cares about the citizens in the country and sees this terrific sacrifice some of these people had made on our behalf in Vietnam, worked for us, been interpreters, and so forth. It was a hard time.
It's a little bit like what we are struggling with today.
Yes.
On this Muslim ban is the fact that we have young Muslims helping us defeat these people who aren't really Muslims. They're just fanatics.
Well, I think the thing that bothered me about the ban was I discovered that grandparents did not count as family. And when you love your grandchildren greatly and then you're not counted as family, that is gut-wrenching. That really tears at your heart.
All right, let's back up a little bit in time and let's go to Nixon and McGovern and that campaign.
Well, as a bystander who was a McGovern aide in this county, Effingham County, I was disappointed by the way the race was run. Nixon came across as the chest-pounding patriot, and McGovern is the wimp. And in truth, during World War II, McGovern had flown 24 bomber missions over Italy. He was the combat pilot or bombardier. He was the true patriot. And Nixon was on an island in the Pacific where he took care of the personal needs of the fighter pilots that came back. In fact, one man wrote a letter to Life and said, "Oh, I remember him now. He's the one that always handed me a cold beer when I came back." So had I been McGovern, I would have fought much harder. He was not the softy they pretended him to be, or the Republicans outlined him to be. But that was his choice. He should have fought back.
So then let's fast forward to Watergate and the hearings, because I remember as a 13-year-old you watched every bit of them.
Yes. The thing I most remember about that, along with the hearings, Sam Erwin and so forth, was that I was in grad school at Eastern that summer. And in between, we had a 2-hour class break, and we would go to the Union and grab a soft drink and sit there for 2 hours, mesmerized, and watch that. And Sam Erwin was incredible. He was not only a good legislator, he would have been a good actor. And the nails were just pounded into Nixon's coffin. And of course, when Butterfield revealed that there was this taping system, that was the end of it. The stair steps just clicked, and all those who were involved, the 3 people who resigned, the special investigator and the attorney general and then the assistant, that was it. It was going. And yet I must tell you that when the day he gave his farewell speech and left the White House, I did have tears for his wife.
Well, okay, yeah, I did not, because I had to listen to that for the entire summer, but also I thought, I guess simply because I was so young and in junior high, but also because when he gave the peace sign, getting into the helicopter, I thought was pretty atrocious for what he had done to the country.
Okay.
What did you think about in the testimony that summer of John Dean?
Oh, I was mesmerized by John Dean. He was so detailed and so dispassionate and so incredibly effective. And of course, there's always an aside to everything. And women were amazed by the poise of his wife as she sat there and listened to this. But no, he was articulate, and he was
pretty courageous, I thought.
Yeah, he was courageous, and he held your attention. I mean, you just were frozen.
So Nixon resigns, and then what did you think about President Ford?
I was very impressed by President Ford. When he was in the House, I felt he was much too partisan. I thought really ridiculously partisan. But once he assumed the presidency and was in the White House, I was very impressed by him.
Did you agree with his pardon of Nixon so he wouldn't have to face charges?
No, that stunned me. He announced that on a Sunday, and I was in the car alone coming home from church. And I remember I was at a stop sign in Effingham, and as I waited for the traffic to pass me at the other stop signs, the breaking news came on the radio, on my car radio, and it said the president was going to speak. And so then I moved forward and drove home, and I was dumbfounded. But I understand why he did it. I didn't condemn him for it.
But do you think that lost the election for him, along with the mistake he made in the debate about Russia?
I thought, although I liked him very much, the Democrat in me supported Carter. And the pardon didn't seem to have clicked that negatively within the public. But when he made that mistake in the debate and said that Eastern Europe was not under the control of the Russians, that was a dreadful. I don't know why he did that.
Even when I can't think who the moderator was, let him go back and kind of fix it.
Right.
And he
did not.
Yeah, that was too bad. Because he was, I think, a very nice.
Yeah, he was a nice man, and I really respected her.
So we get to the next election, and I'm 16, and we worked really hard for Governor Carter. And what did you think about his presidency?
I thought it was pretty courageous in that he got the Panama Canal Treaty, and then of course got Menachem Begin and Sadat to agree. And I was not impressed with Ronald Reagan, but that would take another hour. So In fact, I was dumbfounded.
Do you think Carter, looking back now at Carter's time in the White House, like, I agree with so much, like, he had a conservation policy and things like that, but he kind of still was, he didn't embrace kind of being in Washington, D.C. a little bit, and I think you do have to reach out because you are the governor of Georgia and coming to D.C. Do you think that hurt him somewhat?
I think it hurt him. First of all, like many Southerners, he smiles a great deal when he should probably have glared. Secondly, the Republicans made him out to be a wuss cakes, and here was a man who had been in the, nuclear sub business for 11 years. He was very brave. And he was prescient about the environment. He set up a U.S. government research lab in Colorado to study the effects of carbon, et cetera, on our environment. And the minute that he lost and Reagan took office, Reagan canceled it. No, Carter is bright. He just did not project an air of masculinity. He didn't come across as strongly as Kennedy had, or Truman, or Roosevelt.
What are your thoughts recalling the Iranian embassy takeover and those people who were captured and kept as prisoners?
That happened because Kissinger talked Carter into letting the Shah come, and they just erupted. And then, of course, the rescue failed, and that hurt too, terribly. That really hurt him. I think if he had been a naval veteran of actual combat, had he been a little taller, this sounds really, I don't mean to sound picky, but had he smiled less, had he projected a little Andrew Jackson, I think it would have helped him a great deal. He would have come across as a more powerful personality.
And you think that Reagan somehow, whether you like him or not, projected that a little bit more in that campaign, that next campaign?
Yes, and that's what's so amazing about it, because Reagan likes to tell the story that when the war came to an end in August of '45, he went home and kissed his wife, and somebody reminded him he'd done that every night because he was stationed in Hollywood. All he did was make films. And but he came across as more masculine than Carter, and here Carter had risked his life for multiple years in nuclear subs on our behalf. That's just, much of this is television.
And yet his administration had terrible issues. They had
dreadful issues.
Scandals,
yes, and they sweep that under the rug. Yeah.
That he's the great communicator.
Yeah. Iran, Contra, and the number of cabinet people that were imprisoned, or the deficit he left, all that,
Do you think that maybe at the end of his presidency, towards the end of the presidency, that the Alzheimer's had started, possibly? Because it was so bad towards the end of his life. I mean, it's a progressive disease.
I cannot remember the author's name, but I know he wrote a book about Reagan that was fairly gentle, called Dutch, and because that had been Reagan's nickname as a young man. And he wrote in the book that Reagan did not remember someone from one day to the next. So that he had talked to Reagan one day and had dinner with him the next night at the White House, but Reagan did not remember him. And he felt that, yes, Alzheimer's had begun.
Maybe slow dementia too. Okay. So we get into the next election between Michael Dukakis and George Bush Sr., who actually now, I do like George Bush Sr. and his wife. I didn't then. But that was such an atrocious... so really, we need to talk about Lee Atwater then, I think, a little bit.
Well, yes, but Lee Atwater could have been silenced had Dukakis been a little tougher. I always remember that they got him on ABC one night, and they tried to draw out some of his stronger points, and he was just so mellow. And that whole thing about I can't think of the name of the prison inmate that did damage in.
Willie Horton?
Willie Horton. Reagan and Bush, the vice president, had a Willie Horton in Texas who had gotten out on a leave and gone into a Methodist church office and killed people. And Dukakis wouldn't use that. And Jim Wright, who was in the Congress from Texas, begged him to, but he wouldn't do it. And then, of course, when they made fun of him in the tank with that hat on, he actually had served in the military for 2 years in Korea. He hadn't ducked it. I don't know. He should have been much more forceful. And then, of course, they used his wife's depression against him. And they put out the line that he was depressed. And I remember that Reagan had a press conference in his office, a la FDR. And he said sent his condolences to Governor Dukakis because he understood that he was ill. And it wasn't Dukakis, it was Kitty. And she had gone through a point of depression but had come out of it. But no, it was a badly handled campaign, I thought.
And he has taken the flack for that because he even told Susan Estridge, his campaign manager, after that debate where he wouldn't say that he would use the death penalty if his wife had been murdered and raped. But during the same time period, do you remember living in Effingham, wondering about this whole new, during that time period in the, I'd say early to mid 70s, about this whole, the conservative, this whole born again Christian movement and how that was changing politics and how they used that? Was that happening in Effingham as well?
Oh, definitely. And it definitely happened in the last election when both the Pentecostal churches and the Catholic Church waged quite a war against Mrs. Clinton for a woman's right to choose.
Can you be more specific of what the priests in Effingham did?
Well, he told a friend of mine that she was dooming herself to hell if she voted for Hillary. And now that doesn't mean all the women responded positively to that threat. I know some that did not, that voted for Hillary, but
so the residuals of Roe versus Wade and this born again Christian movement still lingers.
Oh, definitely.
Here, not it lingers across the country, especially in the South. But okay, so then we get to, let's go to President Clinton and that election, because that would definitely be a part of this as well.
Do you mean his first term?
Well, just that first election and
Okay.
how ugly that was. And
I was really surprised by that. I did not think he would win. But since then, at least in this area in which I live, churches of conservative faith have really multiplied. I was born in Effingham. I lived here for 2.5 years, and we went to Springfield, and I came back when I was going to be 16. During that time, and all during my high school and college time, it was basically a Lutheran church, a Baptist church, a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church, and 2 Catholic churches.
So that's from like 1949, 45 to when?
Maybe
Early 70s?
yes. And now we have a multiplicity of Pentecostal churches.
And so do you think then, after Clinton, that continuation of America becoming more conservative, especially maybe with the help of this abortion fight, helped then George Bush Sr. then become president 2 terms? Or, I'm sorry, George Bush Jr.?
Well, oh yes, but
W.
of course, Kerry, after the election was over, released his combat record. He should have released it almost immediately because, once again, as McGovern, he had a great combat record.
So, and this is actually living in a small town in the middle of Illinois. This is kind of really reflects what's happening across the country, doesn't it?
Yes, downstate is much more conservative.
And Effingham County's become more conservative, I would
Oh
say.
my goodness. Oh my, yes. Trump won with 77% of the vote, which just does not make sense to me, but then.
So, let's fast forward now to, let's talk about 2016 in Effingham County and what you saw, and then how you say that you don't understand because of the economics of the county.
Effingham County is a small rural county that's extremely prosperous due to agriculture and light manufacturing and the fact that we have two interstates intersecting here. All you have to do is go to any of the local stores and just take a look at the new cars. They abound. Trucks, cars, bicycles, motorcycles, the houses that are being built. There's a shortage of affordable housing here, but not a shortage of lovely new homes, major homes. Many of the homes that are on the market are at the lowest rate, $200,000. I was in a bank line yesterday and I had a woman ahead of me, and she was in a supersized Lincoln sedan, and she had 2 Trump stickers on her bumper, and she is not a besieged, ill-paid minimum wage worker who's been undone by an immigrant. Ironically, the immigrants we have here work in restaurants and motels owned by Republicans. So
without them, that would really hurt the service industry in this county.
it would hurt the service industry, yes. In fact, we do not have enough service workers here at the current time, basic service workers, to fill the openings in 2 new restaurants that are being built. Panera's putting up a new restaurant, and another, Chubby Checkers or some such, not that, what is it? What's the one?
Chili's?
Chili's. They can't get enough cooks, and we're not talking bottle washers or anything. We're just talking about, or bartenders, cooks, supervisors. They can't find enough. They're searching in other counties.
I'm not sure you would know this or not, but would you know how the children of these immigrants have been greeted in the public schools in Effingham? Is there an English?
There's a
second language
I'm
program?
no longer. I don't believe the teacher who did this was. I know we had a wonderful teacher who taught English as a second language. She was from San Antonio. She was Hispanic. She was very well versed in both Spanish and English and Portuguese. She was really great, a very lovely personality. She told me once that everything went pretty well until they got into high school, and then there was some dichotomy. As a teacher and then a retired substitute, I can tell you that Asian American children, whether they be strong academically or just of average academic level, are a joy to work with. They're courteous to everybody. They have a great sense of humor. They're gentle. I'm very impressed with them.
But wouldn't you also say, though, that when people, to feel part of a society, need to feel as if they're valued in a society? And
Yes.
maybe the children of Hispanic heritage who are newly immigrants here don't always feel that way. That's happened in other parts of the country with Muslim kids.
That's true.
And that has caused some
That's true.
issues.
I do not remember dealing with any Hispanic children who appeared unhappy. But remember, I was subbing now in grades 6, 7, and 8. And I know several of them have performed well athletically, and of course that's a big pitch for them. These are young men who's performed well, particularly in football and track. And so that was a plus. But
do you think that in your lifetime, have you seen any other time that seems that the country is so divided politically as it is now?
it was initially at the time of McCarthy. And
because they're pro people who thought McCarthy was doing the right thing.
yes, and when Eisenhower finally called a halt to him, and some of his machinations were exposed, and the falsehoods, then things got better.
So do you think that's what is going to happen now, given what's happening in the news over this Russian story?
Yes. I think, and this is just, that there will be some interesting revelations involving bank debt.
Do you find that people in this community, which is kind of just middle America, really, discuss this? The Russian story? Do you hear people talk about that, or no?
No. I just, well, when I'm with my group of teacher friends, yes. But I have two people with whom I deal fairly regularly. One is a former student who's probably in her mid-40s. She's a lovely young woman, but she was not a good student. She's married to an older man who's on dialysis. And she voted for Trump, and now she's worried. And the other one is a young hairstylist who has a degree in agricultural science from Carbondale, but has gone to beautifying women. And she comes from a very prosperous family, and I don't think she knows anything that's going on beyond the boundaries of Effingham County.
Well, let's skip that, because the Russian thing's so political. What about, do you hear people talk about the health care debate?
Well, I haven't, because everybody I know is covered by health care, whether it's teachers' retirement or Medicare or I do think my former student whose husband's on dialysis is Medicaid. I'm sure she is, because her job is very minimal and he cannot work.
So we'll kind of look over the different topics that we've discussed this afternoon. What changes would you say good, and some that maybe aren't as good, that you've seen happen in your country? Things that you think are positive, and maybe some things that are negative.
As a grandmother, I'm extremely concerned about our environment, and I think it's just ridiculous that we've pulled out of the Paris Accord. I think it's ridiculous that the now majority party is the only major political party in the world today that negates climate change.
Do you think that some of that stems from the fact that some people just aren't very educated about the environment today where you live in this county?
I think it's true in the United States that too many people are focused, forgive me because I used to be a baseball nut, on sports and just consumerism. Do they have the latest car? Do they have go to the best place to obtain a steak? Will their child get into the University of Illinois or whatever? They're all focused on me, and I don't see them focusing on the country or the citizenry as a whole.
So, do you think it would help if maybe in education that history would be tested?
Oh, yes.
And there'd be more of a focus on history instead of just not negating English or math, but
yes,
what are your thoughts on that?
I am so upset about that. And I can't speak as eloquently as David McCullough, but no, I think it's just ridiculous. I think all presidents should be history majors, not just U.S. but world. We wouldn't have gone into Iraq, I don't believe. No, I am just beyond that. And I'll never forget when I first started subbing after I'd retired, and we had gone into Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth. I found these 6th grade kids I don't know what they were talking to me about, and they didn't know where Iraq and Afghanistan were. So I got a map and we put it on the board, and I don't know. It's a little bit like the America Firsters of the 1930s. they close their eyes to threats and pretend that it's more important to have fireworks on the 4th of July or a new car. I don't know. But I am history.
Well, we're kind of closing or coming to the close of our time, but what are your thoughts on what's happening, what you thought about the state that you've grown up in, that you've raised your children in, that your grandchildren live in, to what is happening now in the state? Maybe you could summarize that for a little bit.
First of all, I am totally disgusted when everybody downgrades Illinois, including our governor, because I've done a little minimal research. We contribute more to the national coffers than we take, whereas our neighbors, Indiana, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, I think maybe Michigan, all take more from the government than they contribute to the government. I think our schools are superior to theirs. And I am disgusted that we have a governor who lives in a county where the school taxes are high, and yet they want to denigrate the public schools. And our president, in his inaugural speech, in 18 minutes of zip, said that public schools are awash in money and not teaching. I think most of these legislators who say things like that, or presidents who say things like that, need to work in schools as an aide and see what's being done. I'm especially concerned about pre-K education. I think it's very important. This is an all-white county, basically, and we do have a level of poverty, and too often it's young couples that have children that they cannot provide for adequately, and those children need pre-K. And I know that David Stockman, Ronald Reagan's first director of Office of Management and Budget, has preached for several years that you should not let tax levels fall. You must maintain public education, public health, and public safety. And now that Illinois has finally got a budget and we've raised the tax a little bit, we need to. Don't pontificate about the success of Northern European countries and ignore the fact that they pay high taxes so that they can have good schools, good health care, and good roads and bridges and so forth.
All right, let's close with this. So, knowing Greenville as you did and still do, and Effingham as you did and still do, and kind of summarizing, do you feel that the communities physically have changed that much since you were growing up?
I don't think Greenville has, but Effingham has. And this street I live on is a main street. And the first 2 blocks of the eastern end of this street, from the end of the business district for 2 blocks, and then there's my block, which remains unchanged. We've lost 14 homes to business. Now, these homes were not palatial, but they were nice. They were well kept. People were proud of their lawns and their flowers. And if you rode your bicycle uptown, or you walked uptown, or as you passed in a car, you know, you waved, you talked, you knew who they were. And all that is gone in spacing of minor businesses.
So do you think that's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think you're losing the historical sense of your city interior, because all the new homes are building way out. So you would have to drive 2 miles to get to a grocery store, even though you're in the city limits. I have fought very hard to keep this section of my street business free.
Because how long has this family owned this property?
Okay, I'm living on a piece of property, not in the house, but on a piece of property that has been in this family since the late 1880s, and 5 generations of us have lived here. My grandparents, my parents, my mother's family, my daughters, and my granddaughter have all lived here. 5 generations, and I feel great pride in this piece of grass, this piece of dirt, in this lot.
Well, I want to thank you for letting me interview you today for my class, and I feel that you did a great job.
Well,
and
I hope so.
Nice just not to know about a home, but the evolution of the time that you have lived in and what you have seen, and
Oh, right.
what was the oral histories that were given to you.
Yes.
So,
I have to repeat what I may have said earlier. My parents were the product of World War I and the Depression and World War II. That was a traumatic transitional period, and they were part of all that, and they included me in it too. Thank you very much.
thank you.